Hello, and welcome to Elevating Voices Share Your Story. I'm your host, Joelle Tamraz. I'm a survivor, a speaker, an author, and a coach. And today, my guest is Daniella Mestyanek Young. Daniella is a cult scholar and the author of the acclaimed memoir, Uncultured. And today, we're going to be talking about how this book came about, but I'm also going to be asking her about another book that she wrote at the same time called UnAmerican, and another project that she has in nonfiction called The Culting of America. If you enjoy this content, please like, post your comments, and subscribe to the channel to hear more transformational stories. Welcome. How are you today?
I'm so good. Thanks for having me.
So, my first question is tell us a little bit about Uncultured. When did you start to think you wanted to write a memoir? And when did you actually publish the memoir?
Okay, so I think I was always going to be a writer. Um, I got into college by writing the story of my life in short essay form, and then I majored in literature, and then I commissioned into the Army. And actually, while I was 24 years old, deployed to Afghanistan, is when I started writing my first memoir. And it was called A Girl from Nowhere. And I look at the book proposal now because I wrote a whole book proposal for it. And it was like, the ending is kind of unfinished because I don't know what's happening yet. Which, by the way, is where I kind of think a lot of cult memoirs are, where they just kind of give you and then I survived, but they don't really know kind of like what their point of view is. They're still like very early in that transformation, which I maybe hadn't even started, right? I was still just in another high control group, the Army, trying to survive and trying to do my thing. I did, though, put the phrase "the girl from nowhere" in Uncultured, and I'm very proud of that.
So you got it in there.
But
Yeah.
I went into the military and I was an intelligence officer, which is the person that is the expert on the enemy, but it's also just the person that does a lot of speaking presentations all the time. So I kind of say it's kind of like the people that major in English and then go to be technical writers, right? Before
Right.
they come back and do their books. So I've always been writing in one way or another. But I actually had like two interesting impetus moments for this book. So the first one, I was standing in my kitchen listening to the last phrase of the book Educated, which is a super viral, kind of single family cult memoir. And it was 2018, so Donald Trump was president. There was a cult leader running America. And I finished her book and I was like, man, why didn't I write that first? And then my next thought, and I credit this to the fact that I was in entrepreneurship at the time, where they say,
Yeah.
like, if somebody's done it first, it's not competition, it's proof of concept. And so I was like, I
Right.
very quickly got to like, oh no, I'm going to write the next one of those. Like, I'm writing cultured, I called it, in the tradition of Educated. So much so that I named it Cultured. And then my co-writer called it Uncultured very early on. And we were like, that's all she wrote.
Yeah.
Because of course that's what it's really about. It's this kind of parallel story of me growing up in one of the world's most notorious religious cults, which is kind of this micro, people like to think obviously wrong concept, but
Mm.
that humans will do anything to fit into their groups. And then I was like, and then I'm going to show you that again in the US Army, which is a very much more macro concept that all of us support, at least with our taxes, right?
Right.
And really, my whole goal is to get people to think, what cults are you in? Which is the inscription I put in every book that I sign.
Yeah.
So
That was
that was
2018.
that was 2018, right? And that was also when I was like, I need to do this now. Like, I need to get this book done now because
Yeah.
there's a cult leader running America now. And
Right.
so, also from entrepreneurship, when you have a great idea, but you don't have all the skills yourself, you go find a co founder. And so I went and I found Brandy Larson, who I call the co-parent of Uncultured. And she was the one that told me, I think, the most important thing for writing a memoir, which is just, if you are an unknown person, and I think even if you're not, your memoir isn't about you, it's about one idea. So like one idea that is the through line. So for Educated, my version of that is that education is our best defense against extremism.
Right.
That's what her book is about. And my book is
True.
about this thing I said earlier, because as soon as she asked me that question, I was like, oh, I know. It's this concept that humans will do almost anything to fit into their groups. I can show you that in the cult. I can show you that in the army. And then from there, we like backwards plan the whole book that reads like a chronological story of my life. But we
Right.
crafted a story, right, out of real events to show that point of view that we're talking about, right? So
And you
that
speak
was,
as someone who's within these cults versus someone who's joined the, I mean, you didn't join Children of God, you were born into it. So
yeah. And I just say that, like, I speak this language as my mother tongue, right? Like cults and coercive control, like, you know a lot about it, but I was in it from the beginning, right?
right. Yeah.
Disorganized attachment, all of that stuff. So, and then the second moment, which was really important to me, because I started working on this book immediately in 2018, right? And Brandy and I were working on it for about 2 years, but I still wasn't like totally sure that I was going to blow up my entire life by writing a memoir, because that is what happens in one way or another.
Yeah.
Um, until this news story broke about this young Mexican American soldier who had gone missing uh, from the military, and it had been over 60 days before they found her body in 3 shallow graves.
Oh my God.
And the reason the 60-day thing is so important is that in the United States military, if a rifle or some other piece of sensitive equipment goes missing for more than 60 minutes, they will shut down the whole base, and everyone from general to private will look until it's found. And they call
Wow.
this Hands Across America. So it was like this immediate signal that nobody cares about women in the military. Like, they care more about rifles than they care about us.
Mm.
And so I was just like very triggered, in PTSD, like literally sitting in the dark in the motorhome I was living in. This is all during COVID, by the way, 2020.
Yeah.
And I'm like, first of all, one, I was like, they would have looked for me. I was a white, straight presenting captain. They would have
Mm.
looked for me faster than that. And I
Mm.
didn't have people that were coming for me, right? Like, this system just assesses me to
Yeah.
be of higher value. And my second thing was just like, why doesn't America care? Right.
Yeah.
And what was interesting was, because I was already in the publishing process, getting told that we don't publish books about children of God because it's too horrible. The abuse is too horrible. You can't put that on the page. And we
Mm.
don't publish books about women in the military because nobody reads them. Right. And
Right.
so I had this very clear moment where I was like, oh, like, America doesn't know. Like, Children of God really is one of the worst cults in history. It should be at least as famous as your Jonestown and
Yeah.
Waco and Charles Manson. Yeah. And so, the Children of God essentially makes all of the lists of really bad cults, because they went from ostensibly being about love, faith, and Jesus to religious prostitution, pedophilia for God, and this just constant apocalypse kind of end of the world preparation. But we don't know more about it in America because they won't tell the story, right? Because how do you put pedophilia on the screen or on the page without like re-victimizing the victims, like me,
Right.
who had no choice but to grow up in this thing? And then by the same token, like, nobody reads books by military women because they're not publishing the books by military women in the mass market with the big publishers. They're seeing it as
Right.
this very niche market. And so in that moment, I was just like, somebody is going to have to bleed their soul onto the page and like really tell the story of
Mm.
what life is like for the daughters of America when we disappear behind the high commune walls of the Department of Defense. And they're going to need to do it at a big enough, high enough level that they don't have to ask the Pentagon for permission to protest them. Which is to say, you know, most of the books by military women are forced to fall into one of two categories. Either like you were the first at doing something, which I was also, but the book sounds like it was written by the Pentagon, right?
Okay.
Including when she discusses her own assault. And, or it's this kind of like burn it all down book, but it's with a small publisher, the military can just shrug it off like, oh, they were a bad soldier. But I was like, oh, I can do both, right?
Mm.
Because I have this huge cult story, I can get, hopefully, fingers crossed, a big enough book deal that I can market my book to the American public and not to the military
Got it.
only, right? As this
Yeah.
niche market. And so
So
I
that
did.
was in 2020,
And
the
so I did.
second moment? So that second light bulb moment, was that in 2020 then?
That was in 2020. And that was when I was like, okay, I'm really clear now. And one of the things I'm really clear on is that this is a book that is critical about both the cult and the military. And that, you know, like the US Army doesn't come off as the better cult, let me just tell you, by the end, right? Or tell the listener.
Yes, it's a
Um,
difficult line that you walk there, because they don't come off as the smaller cult, but at the same time you're not completely, discrediting everything about it. You're just saying in this context there are things we need to fix.
and I think what's even interesting is I have seen some criticism of like she's not critical enough of the military,
Okay.
which now 3 years after it's come out, I kind of agree with. I was still, and I always say, you know, I think people should wait 10 years to write their book. The author of The Crown says that too. He says that like history hasn't decided the story yet. But
Interesting.
it also, I think, really correlates with this, I call the decade of deconstruction that we have to go through after these high control experiences to understand them. And
Yeah.
so now, again, not even 3 years, because the book came out in 2022, September. So not even 2 years since it's come out. And it's like 9 years since I've been out of the military. And I feel very differently about it. You know, we've also had the fall of Afghanistan and, you know, a lot of moments that caused me and my peers to question our belief like in the cult and what we were doing and all of that too. So that is, you know, that's kind of an interesting thing about memoir, right? Like I'm still very proud of the book. I stand by every word, but I am now a different person
Mm.
as 37-year-old Daniella than the 1 to 27-year-old Daniella that you are getting the
In
story about.
Yeah, no, and that's great. And we'll talk about how, you're planning to write other things.
Right.
And since I've been listening, the more recent Daniela on your TikTok channel, I get some other of those viewpoints that, as you say, are perhaps more, have gone to a different place compared to the book. So did you have an agent at that point in 2020, or did you then attract an
I
agent? Tell us
did.
just a little bit about that, and also
Yes,
your
I
your
did.
book deal.
So I actually like to say that I have a book not because I have an incredible story or because I'm a great writer, but because I'm a really good military planner. So
Okay.
when I decided that I was going to embark on this project, I was like, I need to make a plan. And in fact, actually, there was a lovely white Christian male Republican man who told me that I should just self publish because getting a traditional book deal was like winning the lottery
Yeah.
because you can't reverse engineer like a best-selling memoir. And
Right.
even literally, even in that moment, I was like, I don't think you understand reverse engineering. Like you can reverse engineer anything.
Yeah.
My formula that I came up with for best-selling memoir was, really interesting, unique, well written, or really interesting, unique origin story,
Yes.
right? Well written stories, well told, with ideas that matter to everyone. Like my book is about, the same man told me that there was no market for my stories because a nice girl from Milwaukee that has never had anything bad happen to her can't understand growing up in a sex cult or being a woman at war. In which moment I was like, I disagree that there is a nice girl from Milwaukee that has never had anything bad happen to her.
Right.
We all live in the world as women and share a certain amount of experiences. In fact, Brandy Larson, who helped me write the book, is my nice Jewish girl from New York and Florida who has had, of course, bad things happen to her,
Right.
who helped me write the book, um, in order to talk to all of these people. So I started making a plan, and one of my things was I found a writer who had done a very similar kind of book, and I asked her for advice, and then I took all of her advice. um, I joined the right Facebook networking group. There's a group for women writers. That you have to know someone to invite you in. But if any listeners want, they can find me, Daniella Mestyanek Young, on Facebook, and I can invite you in. For women, any definition of women who are in any part of publishing. And the group I got into for memoir writers was just so helpful and so open and so wonderful. And one of the things I heard about very quickly was this book called The Byline Bible by Susan Shapiro, and it's just the most tactical book I know. And it's exactly for, so you want to write a memoir. Okay, what you need to do is you need to get a article, in a splashy article, in a venue that editors and agents read. And that story needs to show that you have range, right? That they want to finish this essay and go, oh, she's working on a book, I want her,
What
right?
else can she tell us?
Um, and so I took that, and another piece of advice she has in that book is if you want to be paid for your writing, maybe invest a little in your own craft and take a writing course. And so I did. I took this $250 course at the Hugo House in Seattle, where I was living at the time, which was recommended through this group. And it was wonderful. This course on show and tell writing. And it's where I workshop the chapter that ended up, helping to sell the book in the proposal when I got to that stage. And so as I was doing those things, there was a call for pitches put into the group. So again, find the right networking group. And the pitch was basically, I want a story I've never heard before, or I want a twist on a story I've heard 1,000 times that is brand new.
Good
And
one.
so I did two things right with my pitch, which was one, she had an easy to misspell first name, and I did not misspell it. Being a Daniella, I know these things. And the second part of my pitch was, essentially, what about Americans cheering on 9/11?
Yeah.
And because I'd written nothing before, she accepted it on spec, which is where you write it, and then if they like it, they pay you. And it was for a magazine called Narratively. And so I want to say this is by September of 2019. So a year into my process, this article comes out, and it's called I Escaped the Cult, but I Couldn't Escape the Cult Mentality. And I'm paralleling this moment on 9/11 that I have my realization as a 14-year-old teenager in a cult that oh, maybe we are the religious extremists. And then I parallel it with a soldier, not funeral, but memorial send-off service of bodies of those we've lost in war. But I'm thinking well, the guys on the other side who died today, like, believe that they died for the right thing also. You know, like, if you're willing to die for something, you believe you're right.
Yeah.
And that's why being willing to die for an ideology is part of the definition of extremism. And so that story, ironically enough, that article, which people can read, it's still up, kind of turned, it was the 3,000 word version of what Uncultured became, because I had to sort of tell my whole life story to tie those two pieces together. And I learned to write a great article from that experience, which was really good. And then parts of luck come in, right? So 4 days later, I get a call from the juniorist agent at a very large New York publishing agent, literary agency, and he wants to like sign me immediately. And
Based on your
I,
narratively article?
yep. And I chose to go with the first thing that came, and I was like, he'd never sold memoir before, but I was like, yeah, but if you know the second lieutenant that works for the general, you can sometimes get in with the general, right? And so I signed with them, and I never heard from anyone else again, right? Like, off of that article, like, it was just that one. And there were several things throughout the process where my co-writer, who's a former publishing executive, was like, this never happens. This never happens. So I did, like, there was luck, but there was also timing, right?
Yeah.
And so again, I've gotten some pretty public criticism for choosing to use a co-writer and not spending a decade to teach myself and unearth my whole story on my own. But like I said, like, a cult leader was actively running America. Like, I needed to say it sooner than that. And in fact, the reason my book would end up selling as big as it did, I think, had a lot to do with January 6th and the fact that I had a book proposal just ready to go.
Yeah, yeah, then things move quickly. Now, I know that so for people who well, a lot of people may know your book. This was published in September 2022. So 2 years old, the hard uh, back version, as well as the ebook, and I think the paperback is a year old. But I've heard you talk about another memoir, Un-American. Tell us a bit about that, because I'm fascinated that in parallel you have this other memoir on similar on a similar period. I won't say on the same themes, but where you pick up some of the same time frame.
Okay, yes. And to do this, I have to tell you still a little bit more about Uncultured. Kind of spoiler alerts, but they're not very big ones, right? So in Uncultured, I go from like major recognized cult, Children of God, into what cult scholars will call a 1-1 cult, which is a specific type of abusive one-on-one relationship, which you are very familiar with.
Yeah.
And then I go into the U.S. Army. And quickly in the U.S. Army, I get divorced from the guy. Like, the U.S. Army kind of helps me get away from him. I had chosen not to tell that story because I didn't understand it. So I just was going to kind of cut out this 2-year period of my life because I didn't understand it. And people asked me what was the hardest chapter of Uncultured to write, which has some really, really hard stuff. And doing the audio was so hard too. But it was chapter 17, and it's this kind of nothing chapter where I go to college, and it's called Bring Me to Life. And it's literally, we told it in 2 ways. Ultimately, we told it as this happy-go-lucky college experience, and that would have been all if I hadn't met Jeff. And then we go back and tell it again. Because the thing was, it was hard for me to write that chapter because, like, I did get out of that toxic relationship early on in my military career. And so, hey, Daniella, why did you decide to join the Army? Oh, because I was in a toxic relationship and I didn't know what else to do, isn't a very strong answer for a young officer. And so I fell back on other parts of it, which was patriotism. And I had this crazy upbringing and I felt lucky to be here, and these kinds of things that were true, but definitely were not the whole story. Right. So just as Uncultured is selling, like it is in the air, it is going to happen. We are a country 2 months after January 6th. And I get this email from a military lawyer, and it has my ex-husband's name, William Jeffrey Poole. And we do 3-name him in the book because we kind of want you to Google him. And I'm just thinking, oh, this is just going to be his secret clearance update. And it says major, so I know he's still in the military. He went a rank past me as a captain, and that's all I know. I haven't seen or heard of this man in a decade. We had a very ugly divorce because, like controlling narcissistic partners, when I asked for a divorce, he said no, and if you do it, I'll destroy you. And then he tried. And so, in fact, the email is informing me that he has been caught sort of publicly being a very, very nasty white supremacist, and will I testify against him to help them kick him out of the army? And so in this moment, I'm there going, oh, karma is, but also I'm like, but there's no way, right? There's no way. I have already lived such a big life that I have a big book deal at the age of 33 years old. And also I was married to a white supremacist. And then it literally hit me sort of like a truck that I was like, oh no, I married a white supremacist because I grew up in a cult. You know, it wasn't, I grew up in this cult and then I married a white supremacist. It was connected. And in that moment, I was like, I'm going to have to write him back into the story of my life in Uncultured, because I know already that I have to write a second book. Because in Uncultured, like that moment changed everything about the way I saw my own story, which, as we've discussed, like it's a valid story, but it is a specific lens, right? And I think in Uncultured, I am looking out at the groups around me, right? As I'm telling you my cult stories and my military stories, right? Like the narrator is having you look at the groups. And in UnAmerican, the next book that I would work on, I am looking internally as I go through these cult stories and these military stories, and I'm thinking about power and privilege and whiteness and otherness and what it means to be an American, which have all been like also huge themes in my life. And the interesting thing was, when I say like a different lens, like there was a point when, rather than telling the whole story of us meeting again, I wanted to just copy some stuff from Uncultured, and like it doesn't fit because it's a different lens.
Yeah. Yeah, no,
Maybe
that's
even a slightly
fascinating.
different voice, you know? But it's
So you
not
left
giving you, yes, it's the same story of how we met and how we told each other our stories, but the narrator is having you look at completely different things because these books have completely different themes.
So for our listeners and viewers, Un-American exists as a video book. And I had the wonderful experience of listening/watching. And it's a very relaxed kind of watching. It's not like watching a movie because your eyes might be focusing on Danielle as she is now crocheting or knitting. But it felt like a very different book. Now tell us, when did you write Un-American versus what was happening with Uncultured while you were
Yeah.
busy writing
Okay.
a second memoir?
Okay. So, and this is funny, by the way, in a traditional publishing writer's contract, they have this clause that you're not allowed to publish anything else until you deliver to them the manuscript.
Right.
Which, fun story, is how some of the erotic novels industry got started, because women couldn't publish under their own names, but so they were doing creative projects under pen names. There's an interesting documentary about that, but it was funny because I was like, why would they say that? And then as soon as I got into writing Uncultured, I started thinking of all these other projects, like books that I want to write, things that I want to do. And I was like, oh, they have that because they've met artists before. I get it.
Right.
So literally, as soon as I turned in Uncultured, which, by the way, they gave me 6 months to write
That's
a
incredible.
pretty giant book. I did it in 5 with tons of help. Um, and as soon as I turned that in, I started working on Un-American,
Okay.
which we kind of really hoped would sell to the same publisher, but that's not what ended up happening. But so I worked on that whole project, and in the explanation of why, the market needed Un-American, I wrote the phrase, because we're living through the culting of America.
Yeah.
And then my publisher was like, well, can you write that book? So I was like, okay. So I, with a very heavy heart, set aside Un-American, which had become a 150-page manuscript, because we kind of had to I had to write a whole bunch of the story in order to really boil down chapter summaries and the pitch for the book proposal. So I set this aside and I started working Culting of America, a book which I am almost halfway through. Which I just describe as my whole master's degree in organizational psychology plus everything that I know about cults, put in this one book that is definitely coming out, whether I self-publish it or traditionally publish it. But in the meantime, I was also building my platforms on social media, and I've had a lot of success on TikTok, building a channel where I'm a scholar of cults, extreme groups, and extremely bad leadership. And I just help people understand groups that they're in. I've really found out that I don't actually care about the groups. I study the bad groups because that's what I have all of my life's experience in. That's what the intelligence officer does. That's what I embedded in a cult growing up, right? I mean, not on purpose, but that's what happened.
Yeah.
And so I have all this experience from about the negative side of groups. And I've realized that I don't really care about the groups. I care about helping individuals understand groups that have hurt them in the past, groups that are hurting them now, and groups that are might try to hurt them in the future. And so I'm building myself a really cool career where I am kind of in this niche that everyone's interested in. Everyone's been in bad groups, but not a lot of people are experts on
Yeah.
this exact
Absolutely.
thing. I also think I'm pretty good at making it relevant, because again, like, that's one of my favorite quotes about memoir is people don't read your story, they read their story.
Yeah.
So like, you're telling your story, but you're making it relevant with all these larger ideas. Part of why I love your book, The Secret Practice, so much.
Thank you.
So as I was doing these, building this TikTok platform, which is a video platform, I eventually got to a point where I was like, well, I can't publish Un-American right now, but 100,000 people sit and watch me knit and read books to them basically every day, whether it's other cult books from what I'm researching or whether it's pieces of Culting of America that I read out loud because I'm writing it in sort of an open source conversation with my future reader. And so I was like, maybe I'll just make a 6-hour video of me sitting there knitting and reading Un-American in its current form, which is unfinished, but still interesting. And the reason I even did that was because I say that Un-American was my all too well 10-minute version, if people are familiar with the Swifties. So like, it was mentioned that there was a 10-minute version and then the fans never gave it up. So I had mentioned that Un-American existed, and my following is just like, where is it? When can we get it? And the
Yeah.
answer is, oh, I don't know ever. But, I think I am much more of an entrepreneur of ideas than I am like just a writer. Certainly many people are better writers than me, and some of them work for me when I write stuff. But I think that I'm actually really good at putting some of these experiences into words that many of us have had, in coercive groups or with garbage leaders, but it hasn't been expressed in that way. And then once people hear it, they're like, oh my gosh,
That makes
So one of
sense.
my favorite phrases, because the cult I was in tried to rebrand themselves as the family. And
Hmm.
there are like 3,000 cults we know of that have the family. And one of the things I'm researching is the familial language and how organizations use that to coerce people. But what I
Yes.
say to people is, come on, y'all, anything that calls itself your family wants to overwork you, underpay you, and expect you to put up with more BS than you would otherwise.
Totally.
Right? And all of a sudden, everyone in corporate America is like thinking about somewhere they worked before or now, right?
Yeah. We've all
Who's
heard it
giving
from
you the
some
whole,
boss.
exactly,
And
exactly.
often, Danielle, I also think it's to get at your emotions because they
Yeah.
think that family is something warm and fuzzy, not, the cold, hard reality of a corporate landscape that wants to extract your work for profit. So,
And what cults do is exactly that. Like they take a concept like family and they warp it as much as possible to get at, I describe it like hacking human emotions. So
yeah,
they can like hack your emotions and turn you into kind of this lifestyle puppet, um that they can then go get to labor for them, right? Because cults are always
absolutely.
about labor. And so, part of my platform, even, I have this, I think now kind of infamous 10-part definition of cults because it's above my head in every single video. But like, I didn't even want to put a definition on cult because one of those things I know, because it's my mother tongue, is as soon as you put a definition on it, cultic groups will take that and use that to train their people on how to argue that they're not a cult,
Mm,
right? So like I protect individuals much better by saying any organization that's telling you that they're not a cult, look at that harder than
yes,
I think I do help them by putting this 10-part definition on it. But of course I eventually had to, just because I wanted a framework to help me educate people on how this works. But the reality is, I didn't get lucky with my timing. I saw what was happening in America and I wrote a memoir
mhm,
because I had something to say about what was happening in America. And I know that we're living through the culting of America because I grew up in a legitimate cult that all Americans think is like something they would never join.
yes,
I just wrote this joke the other day. Want to hear it?
yeah,
You know what the
yeah.
answer is to who joins a cult?
Sorry, say again. Start again.
Do you know what the answer is to who joins a cult?
Now who?
Not me.
Yeah.
Right? So like I have this almost like cognitive dissonance of like knowing that just about everything from the cult was super wrong, but then recognizing it everywhere in all these
Yeah.
groups in America. And people get really offended if you compare them or their group to a cult. And I've just kind of made that my job. This is like this is what you do as an intelligence officer in the military. The way we keep our side safe, and I kid you not, it is grown men in camouflage pajamas that call themselves the good guys and the other guys the bad guys with their full chests. My job was to know as much as possible about the bad guys because
Right.
that's how we keep ourselves safe. But that was a thing I saw in, I eventually went on to study organizational psychology at Harvard during COVID, which was a fascinating time to be doing that.
Mm.
And it just seems like it's very happy and peppy and white, and we're changing groups and values and cultures, and nobody wants to talk about the bad stuff. So literally there's, we'll be doing leadership qualities and they'll be like, oh, and then there's the dark triad of leadership over here, psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and narcissism. And like, we'll come back to that. We never came back to it.
That's
And
interesting. Yeah,
I
you'd
just
think
kind
that
of
would
had
be
this,
important.
yeah, but I just kind of had this experience where like, I know that every time I would talk, my classmates would kind of be like rolling their eyes, right? Like, here comes cult lady again, or army lady, or terrorist lady, with her extreme
Mm,
examples,
mm,
right? But they're happy to use the cult tactics. because I kind of feel like in a lot of ways, and no shade to organizational psychologists, these are my people and I love them, but a lot of it is learning human influence tactics, group influence, manipulation. I mean, in every single class I was in, somebody at some point raised their hands. I was like, what is the ethics of learning this?
Yes.
And the only answer we have is like a tool, one man's tool is also a weapon, right?
Yes.
Um, and that's one of the things I tell people, like values are gray, Enron had honesty literally carved in marble out in front of their headquarters, and the Children of God weaponized love, and the Trump administration weaponized loyalty, right? Like, but the thing I realized was just like everyone thinks their groups are the good ones, right? And I get asked all the time about good groups, and nobody likes it when I say I'm not the expert on good groups. But what I can tell you from the bad group perspective and the person whose job it was to look at all the perspective and all the holes is as soon as you start considering yourself a good group, like that's your danger. And the reality is it doesn't matter if something is called a cult, right? Every single major cult that has ever been in the news has had cult experts warning about it for decades.
Yes.
Right? I tell people all the time, like, I'm not the deity that names cults. That's the media. And that usually only happens when we can count the damage in bodies.
When it's
And
too
so
late.
how I teach people about cults, the same way that your book is a cult book, even though you never called it that, is by the storytelling, right?
Yeah.
Is by the like, I don't care how good you think you are, Alcoholics Anonymous. Telling people that they're going to die if they're not in your organization is a cult tactic. Like
Yeah.
it just is.
It creates
And I
this
say,
ultimatum that hooks people in. And
exactly. And I say
exactly
a lot
what
on
you
my
said.
channel, like good and bad are not scientific concepts, right? That is just context that we are putting in. And especially under capitalism in corporate organizational psychology, like we have decided that if you are making money, you are good. You are the good guys. Like people were worshiping Tony Hsieh of Zappos, even after he had been ousted for instituting a crazy management theory and had died in a violent, suspicious way. And people are still like worshiping him because he built successful companies and sold them for a lot of money. And so I'm sitting there reading all these Harvard business reviews and just like seeing all the cult leader stuff in all of it.
Yeah, because there
And
is no ethics in the capitalist system. It's not embedded in it.
Exactly. And, sort of what I realized was like, oh, I'm never going to be able to sell. Like I thought I was going to be a leadership consultant, right? But like I'm never going to be able to sell my services to CEOs because that's kind of like asking someone to do therapy in public. I think
Right.
it's absolutely necessary. And I think it's bonkers that people say stuff like breakfast eats or culture eats strategy for breakfast, but they can all show you a business plan, but nobody can show you a culture plan.
So you wanted to be a consultant that helps with the culture plan? Is that what you thought you might do?
So I think I told you before we started recording that this is like, I feel like I've finally just now pulled my whole brand and career and expertise and everything together, but it's been 7 years.
Okay.
And so 9 years ago, when I left the military, actually, the first thing I identified was I'm really good at being an expert. So I need to go find the next thing to put my expertise into. 2 years after an unfulfilling corporate stint, I was just like, okay, I'm going to do my own thing. And at that point, doing my vision exercises and some of the stuff we do in the entrepreneurship culty world, I was like, okay, I like to teach adults. Like I like that moment when people like get that light in their eyes or like see something they've never seen before and now they see it everywhere. And I wanted to talk about culture on a national and international scale, interestingly enough, because becoming a mom was one of the craziest cultural things I've ever been through, right? Because every culture in the world has stuff that if you do this, you'll hurt your baby. And
Yeah.
a lot of it conflicts. And I was like, this is so interesting. And then I got into you can't spell culture without cult. And like, I have a lot of these group stories. I think I can do something with all of this. But I was like, okay, I want to be paid to write books, speak on stages about culture. And I can do that in one of three ways. I can get a PhD, I can start a leadership consulting company, and I can write a book. And so me being me, still stuck in perfectionism, I started all three. And the book broke first. And so
Right.
I ended up now with a major Macmillan book, a master's from Harvard in organizational psychology, and doing my own consulting my own way.
That's great, Daniela. And thank you so much. Just, you've just shared your wonderful journey into writing, publishing, and becoming, a public cult scholar. Tell us, where can people find you, and where do you share your knowledge now?
Yeah, so I am at Knitting Cult Lady on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. TikTok is where like I spend the majority of my workday as I'm actively researching and writing this book, talking about cults, cults of MAGA, like stuff that's going on now, stuff that I'm researching. It's a pretty fun place, pretty fun community we have there of just like deconstructing cults. And I also run book clubs for people that want to just study more about cults, read memoirs. We read 12 memoirs in 12 months and we start seeing the patterns. Secret Practice is one of the ones we read, Joelle's memoir about her yoga cult. And all of that is through social media. So come find me there. On YouTube, I do some longer forms. I have two podcasts, a podcast about cults and the culting of America, which is like the book, but in a podcast. And then I have another podcast called Hey White Women with a Black creator. And she and I are deconstructing white supremacy like the cult that it is.
Okay. Sounds
And this was
fascinating.
kind of my realization that even though I've had the crack of the brainwashing and I'm as physically and mentally out of the cult of white supremacy as I can be, that doesn't still mean I don't have a decade of deconstruction ahead, right? To just the time it takes to unlearn all of these concepts that have been planted in our heads by the different cults. And so we're just doing that out loud and in public, having the conversations. I have nothing to justify about my upbringing, so I can have this very vulnerable conversation, and I learn so much every day. We're actually Tuesdays is when we record, so doing that today. And all of those can be found anywhere you get your podcasts. And
Great.
also Uncultured can be bought wherever you buy books. It is on audio. I did record it myself. You can also get it on audio through your libraries from Libby, and I sell autographed copies on my social media.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. It's been great chatting with you. And I learned something every time we speak. Yeah, so go find Daniela, read her books. Uncultured is fabulous, and Un-American I also highly recommend as a video book. And I just wanted to add, when you were chatting about Un-American, I think the power of getting something else out if you're a writer for your audience is people, if they've enjoyed your work, they're kind of hungry for your next story. And
Exactly.
especially in the traditional publishing time frame, that might be a while. So, it's great to give them another story.
Yeah, exactly. Plus, it's just more time to like work on the themes, right? You almost get to test it with your audience. I mean, that's what I'm experiencing writing my research book kind of in public. It's just like people give me stuff that adds to the argument that I'm building, which is really cool. And then I also should do a plug for the little product that you and I made, which is that I made a video book out of Joelle's really wonderful memoir, The Secret Practice. Just because I loved it so much. And so that is also available on my Patreon, which we can link.
Yeah.
And we split the money. But if you are interested in watching me knit and read Joelle's book to you, that's just like an option that lives out there in the world.
Yes, thank you so much. People have really been asking for an audiobook, and when Daniela suggested the video book, I jumped at the idea. Really grateful that she took the time to record it. As I said, I love the video book concept, so I encourage people to discover it. Thank you, and see you soon.